Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of moments for people to filter in, and then we will get going. Right, I think we will get going. My name's Sam Lowe. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Centre for European Reform, and I'll be chairing today's session. And I'm very happy to have Philippe Lamberts with us to speak to everyone today. He's the co-president of the Greens / European Free Alliance group in the European Parliament, and he sits on the European Parliament's Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. I'm sure he's quite well known to most of you. He was also on the now defunct European Parliament's Brexit Steering Committee. And he's going to be talking to us today about what place for an ambitious European Green Deal. And we were just discussing just beforehand, this is quite a good day to be discussing this, as there's going to hopefully be quite a few announcements today, and also Merkel is in town. So Philippe's going to open with a 10 minutes, 12 minutes or so of an opening statement, and then we're going to go to questions. I should say that this session is actually now on the record, so do bear that in mind when it comes to your questions, and it's also being recorded. So Philippe, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, everyone. And indeed, we picked a good date, since this is the day when later in the plenary, Ursula von der Leyen will announce the Commission proposal for a recovery plan, and Angela Merkel will be there to lay out the priorities of the German presidency, which I believe will be pretty much dominated by the recovery agenda regardless. So the initial question was, will there be a good place for a Green Deal as part of the recovery plan? Actually, this point might seem moot today, in the sense that when you look at the majority of the European Parliament, when you look at many member states, but even significant parts of the industry, there seems to be a converging pressure to indeed not just a business as usual recovery, but a transformative one. So indeed, you see a growing coalition of stakeholders wanting the recovery plan to be the occasion to transform in depth our economies. Now, it's easier said than done, and we will see whether the proposals are really targeting the Green Deal. So based on what we know about the proposal, the key questions we have to ask to assess the proposal are the following. First, will the size be enough? Well, I would say that we are somewhere in between. So everything that has been put on the table so far was macroeconomically irrelevant. So this was too small to really matter. And you know, the kind of smoke and mirrors, Juncker plan kind of initiatives are not really game changers. This time, the Commission seems to be willing to make a proposal that will be macroeconomically relevant, though not as big as the Parliament wants. So there's a wide majority in the Parliament that adopted a resolution a couple of weeks ago, basically asking for a 2 trillion recovery plan, whose majority would be made up of public investment. So basically European public investment to the tune of 1 trillion or more. Are we going to reach that figure? Probably not. But again, we have now stuff that becomes macroeconomically relevant. The second aspect on which the jury is out is the duration of the plan. Of course, if you want unanimity in the Council, you need to have a fixed term for this extraordinary recovery plan. We don't know yet whether it's going to be long enough, but what we believe is that once put in place, if political expediency or economic situation requires, this instrument might be extending in time. So we are creating here a precedent. Three, the question is the architecture. And there I must say that the Macron-Merkel proposal, and on which I think the European Commission is building up its proposal, really does the thing, in the sense that, yes, this is a common recovery plan, funded together by borrowing together, and ultimately it's going to be reimbursed together. So yes, this is a federal nature recovery plan, and the logic will not be back-to-back loans, which basically would mean that every country has exactly the share of reimbursements corresponding to the share of investments. No, it's going to be mutualized because the biggest part will be spent in the form of grants or direct subsidies to investment projects. So architecturally, it seems to be the right thing. The only caveat here is when the Commission mentions the fact that everything will happen as part of the semester. On the one hand, I understand that the semester is the instrument of economic policy coordination we have, so let's use it. On the other hand, the semester has shortcomings. One is its history. So far, the kind of conditionality that it has put for it has well, not imposed, because the semester is not really binding on member states, but it was a vehicle for supply side neoliberal kind of reforms. But that doesn't mean that it cannot be used for other kind of reforms, such as the European Green Deal or the digital transformation. The question is one of political will. But so the history of the semester is pretty much ideologically charged. The other aspect is that the semester pretty much keeps out parliaments at national and European level, de facto. It is a dialogue between the Commission and the governments, and that means that it's pretty much the executive branch doing the thing, and this is not satisfactory to us. So we really want national and the European Parliament to be heavily involved in providing the guidelines as to how the money needs to be spent. And that leads me to the conditionality aspect, and this is where we are the most worried at the moment, because yes, indeed, there's a choir that says we want this to be aligned with the Green Deal and digital transformation and all the rest of it. Yet, when you see the initial recovery decisions that have been taken at member state level and the rulings of the DG Comp at the Commission level in terms of state aid, you see very little conditionality that is geared towards the European Green Deal, so the green transformation of our economy. And that is indeed worrying for us. So we want to see strong Green Deal conditionality. We want to see strong rule of law conditionality. And we are not totally reassured that this will happen. So are we going to say no because this is not enough? No, of course not. This is a breakthrough, potentially, if we can get to an agreement in Parliament and Council. Yet, this is not the nirvana of the recovery plan. So there we need to be hard work and a lot of pressure to make sure that the Parliament's demands, which we share in terms of orientation of the plan, of democratic control of the plan, of duration, of size, etc., will be met over time. So far, this is what I wanted to say as opening statements.
Wonderful. Thank you. Quite a lot to pick up on there. If anyone has questions, please do click the button to raise your hand and I will bring you in. I'll just, okay, we've got 2 participants with raised hands. I can now see, and we will go to first, I have a Lord Hannay. So if you would like to go first, if you just take a breath before speaking to allow it all to connect up, and then go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And could I just say that I'm very sympathetic to the views that you have expressed, and I'm part of a group called Peers for the Planet in the British House of Lords. But I would like to ask you about something you didn't mention, which is border tax adjustments to take account of the degree to which exporters are are obeying the Paris agreements, and which was in the original Green Deal that the Commission President unveiled at the beginning of this year. I'd like to ask you really whether you don't think that in the light of very, very strong threats which the open world trading system is under at the moment, particularly from Donald Trump, but also from elsewhere, and in the light of the very possibly disruptive impact of the recovery from coronavirus, it really is hardly the moment to install an extremely bureaucratically complex system of new controls on all imports into the EU, and which could be, though I'm sure it wouldn't be from your point of view, but could be very protectionist in its nature. Why, to put it very simply, do we have to find out whether Botswana is obeying the Paris Accords before their exports can enter the EU at a preferential rate, for example? Don't you think it'd be wise to take this one very slowly? Clearly, there are some countries like China and India which will have the ability to damage the European market if they aren't obeying the Paris Accords. But they're a fairly small minority, and aren't you taking therefore a sledgehammer to crack a nut?
Well, I just love this question. Let me say this. The way global trade has been organized under the decades of neoliberal globalization is basically a race to the bottom in terms of environmental standards, social standards, and basically that was a very business model of it. I mean, looking for the cheapest ways of doing things in terms of working conditions, salaries, environmental rules. So race to the bottom was the name of the game. Do we need to get out of that game? Absolutely. Is the answer economic nationalism? Absolutely not. So yes, we need to reduce the global material flows. If we want to reduce our ecological footprint, obviously one of the easy things to do is to reduce the number of food miles, of material miles, of people miles, because of course that has a massive impact on our ecological footprint. Does that mean that we have to close borders? Absolutely not. And there, I sympathize with what you say, and Martin Wolf's column this morning in the FT also stresses the risk to multilateralism and basically a global rules-based world order. And we know that this is severely threatened, first by the likes of Donald Trump, but also by the consequences of the pandemic. So we have to treat carefully here. Now, is carbon border adjustment tax the right tool, regardless of COVID, actually? On paper, conceptually, if I were French, I would say yes, it's very nice. It links market access or it prices basically the non-compliance to globally agreed rules. Yet, as you say, this is, if you want to do this right, it would require an army of controllers if you want to make the border adjustment specific to the real emissions, for instance, of any producer. Do we want to hire an army of controllers for that? Not sure. I want to create jobs that way, because I'm not sure that these jobs would create value. So it may surprise you, but actually I think that the right way to go about this is international trade agreements, but of course of a very different kind. So far, the goal of these free trade agreements have been to increase trade volumes. And I believe that we can no longer do that simply for ecological reasons. Yet there's another aspect of free trade agreements that has been on the back burner for decades, and that should become the very raison d'etre of these trade agreements. It is regulatory convergence. In other terms, yes, we should condition market access to the respect of a number of rules that we jointly agree on the social front, on the environmental front, on the taxation front. But to take back your example of Botswana, we should link market access to progress in fulfilling those rules. Not so the conditionality would be on transitioning and not on the end result. In other terms, no, you don't have to wait to be fully compliant to get market access, but you have to commit and to execute improvements into your social rules, environmental rules, of course, because you cannot impose the same, just imagine, social security. I mean, it didn't come off out of the magic wand in our countries. This was a process that took decades to be achieved. We cannot demand our trading partners to do such evolutions overnight. But the process is very important. And the treaties must be the instrument to basically guarantee the execution of those transition processes. And this is what we need to do. So we need to find like-minded countries in the world, and I'm afraid that there are not that many, but we have really to work with them in order to basically use the free trade agreements as upwards convergence instruments in terms of social environmental taxation rules. If that can be the transformation of our free trade agreements, I'm all for it. And that is probably more efficient and more effective than carbon border adjustment.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. So we'll go to the next question now, and it's from Heather Gravy.
Hello. Hello. I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Heather Gravy from Open Society in Brussels. Thank you very much. This is extremely illuminating, Philippe. I just wanted to ask about how you see the next year playing out for the European Green Deal and all of these measures at political level, because it may take some time, it seems, to get agreement on the recovery fund. I'm hearing from inside the Commission that it may be September before there's a real agreement about it, and both the question of the size of the overall fund, then there's all the other issues around it, that is bound to interact with many of the measures that you're talking about, particularly public investment, but also the political appetite among member states to be ambitious, to be as ambitious as the Parliament would like, or even just as ambitious as the Commission's plans have set out. So I'd be really interested in your view on how you expect the political debate to evolve over the next year, whether you think there are key moments like agreement on the recovery fund that could give it a boost, and whether there are also key moments that could be a major setback. Thank you.
Well, I would say that an early agreement on the recovery instrument is absolutely crucial, and especially in psychological terms. If there's failure of the European Council, remember, the European Council has met already 4 times since the beginning of the pandemic with no result at all, other than press releases. So now is the time to deliver. If they fail to deliver, that will be a major blow to the credibility and to the credibility of the European leadership, but also to the morale of our people. So psychologically, we need a surge, right? And now is the moment. I mean, of course, if it happens in July, it's better than September, but it cannot be December. So to me, we are reaching the make or break moment, and now is really the moment. But actually, I may sound maybe over optimistic, but I do believe that in a way, the frugal 4 can help, because one of the things that the net contributors absolutely need is to reassure their taxpayers that money will not just go to a bottomless pit of public finances, poorly managed public finances in the South. And an important aspect for that is that the recovery fund money goes to investments, that is to projects, not to budgetary support, that are conditioned, that are not just conditioned to supply side reform, but conditioned to contributing to European commons like or the fight against climate change. And that is very important for Scandinavian countries, for instance. So I see a landing zone for a deal, which would say, okay, of course, the southern member states, the eastern member states very much want the recovery fund. I would say, especially in the south, they want a strong recovery fund. In the east, they want a strong European budget. And there will be strings attached in terms of conditionality. And if indeed we can leverage the letter of the Frugal Four in the sense of being strict, not on the labor market flexibilization conditionality, but on the Green Deal conditionality, we may have exactly the kind of pressure needed to get to a good agreement. So I do believe that Nordic member states need to be back to come home saying, listen, we have succeeded in avoiding just giving budgetary support to Italy. In the West, we will need to be able to say, okay, listen, there's strong rule of law conditionality. And so it's not that Viktor Orban will be able to suck even more money for his cronies in Hungary. In the South, they need to be able to say, look, there is real solidarity. Investment will be coming our way. So we will have European investments in all countries that will create jobs and create a future for our economy. So I see the ingredients of a narrative that can be used by each and every head of state or government in its own country to defend the deal. So I hope that indeed they will see it that way. But I think that the chances are there, because now we have the four biggest European Eurozone economies and European economies agreeing on the outline of a plan. That's obvious. It will be, the pressure on the naysayers will be very high indeed. And so they know that they can use their leverage, but only so far, because just imagine that the outcome would be a recovery plan done through enhanced cooperations. The left-outs would be a minority and not a very comfortable one. Therefore, I do believe that the pressure to get to a deal in the Council will be huge.
Thank you very much. On that note, do you not have some concern that the priorities of a Green Deal do not entirely align with where money is most needed right now? In that, would investment in solar and wind, would it actually, if, for example, if there's a big pot of money available for that, does that money go to areas of the EU, that member states that actually need it in the wake of COVID?
Well, let me go back to the Greek example 10 years ago. If you look at Greece's potential and Greece's economy, at the moment, Greece's foreign income comes from tourism and a bit of agriculture, right? Well, Greece could be a net exporter of energy, and you know that energy is the heart of the economy, because Greece has an enormous potential in solar and an enormous potential in wind. But to materialize that potential, to make it happen, you need massive investment. Well, this is precisely a case where actually, if you look at the European energy equation, obviously the South is the place where we have to invest. And by the way, the South is where investment is macroeconomically needed. So yes, I do believe that we can converge these requirements. Frankly speaking, I do believe that it can be made to work. Insulation of buildings, same thing. And of course, you don't insulate them for the same reasons in the North and in the South. But like it or not, climate change is already happening, and we will need stronger insulation if we want people to be able to live in all those countries. When you have summers at 50 centigrades in the South, then obviously you need insulation, not the same kind of insulation as in the North, but you need it regardless. So, I mean, again, this is work that needs to be done, that needs investment capacity. And indeed, it's obvious that in common, the European Union has a bigger investment capacity than the sum of its individual member states.
Thank you. So we have Hugo Dixon next.
Yes, thank you, Sam. Philippe, just a question following on really from what Lord Hannay asked, but specifically related to the UK. Do you see any scope for the UK and the EU post-Brexit making common cause on fighting climate change? And if we fail to make common cause, is it your view that we should just not have an FTA? Or would you think that it would be necessary in those circumstances to apply some sort of border carbon adjustment on imports from the UK?
Well, again, I do not like very much. Well, I find that the carbon border adjustment is not is an unwieldy tool, to be honest. And of course, it would make perfect sense for the UK and the EU to make common cause on climate. But frankly speaking, I am at a loss reading the intentions of the British government in that respect, because it seems to me that the current British Prime Minister is obsessed, well, first by himself, but by having his own Battle of Britain moment. You know, leading the UK through very hard times against a coalition of almost everyone, starting with the European Union and coming out stronger out of it. This is the narrative that he has been using over years. He is not in a very, well, this is antinomic to a cooperative stance that would be required. And when I see, remember, I mean, we concluded not just a withdrawal agreement, but we had a joint political declaration that basically paved the way for a very wide-ranging cooperation between the UK and the European Union. And the consistent attitude of the British government so far has been basically to deny well, to backtrack on the political declaration and wanting as narrow as possible a relationship. And I'm not even sure that this is what is wished for. And actually, pandemic might help Prime Minister Johnson, because that would allow him to drown out the impact of a no-deal Brexit within the wider impact of the pandemic on the British economy, and so basically to have his people swallow the impact, to have his glorious moment. So I'm not very optimistic on that. I do believe that, well, the UK and the EU's economies are very profoundly integrated, and this integration is not a very good idea because geography plays a role. I mean, depending on producers far away creates vulnerability, but I mean, the UK is the exact opposite. It's next door. I mean, we have land borders with the UK, and when we have a sea border, it is very narrow. And in that sense, geography plays a role, and it would be stupid to disintegrate just for the sake of well, claiming to regain control, you know. So I'm not very optimistic. And indeed, we don't know yet whether the UK will really want a free trade agreement with the US. That would indeed be damaging in terms of environmental norms. And if indeed the UK chooses the Trump way, then indeed the European Union will need to avoid social or environmental dumping by British products in the single market, one way or another.
Thank you very much. So the next hand up I have is Stephen Erlanger.
Yes, thank you. Is this okay? Can you hear
Yes.
me? All right, good. Philippe Lamberts from the New York Times in Brussels. As you look at the common agricultural policy, which still has a lot of money in it,
yeah.
How do you actually make it greener? Because to some degree, it has subsidized very bad agricultural
Absolutely.
techniques. So is this a priority? How do you make this work with the new budget and the recovery plan and so on? Thank you.
Well, first, thanks to the New York Times for the work that you've been doing on that topic of late. This is a sole point of our relationship with Ursula von der Leyen from day one. I will never forget our first meeting, which was not very impressive, and our second meeting when we had a hearing in the Green Group, and basically she was already peddling the European Green Deal, or maybe the name was not there yet, but she appeared to be a champion of greening the economy. And we tested her on two things. One was trade policy, because as I said before, the current trade policy is geared towards increasing material flows on the planet, whereas actually we need to do the opposite and to use the trade deals to promote upwards convergence in terms of standards. So was she prepared to transformed the common European trade policy from where it is today to where it should be. And second test was the common agricultural policy. So that's the biggest chunk of the EU budget. And it started decades ago as a project whose aim was to guarantee self-sufficiency for Europe after the war. And that is actually what should be done today, but in a way that respects the planetary boundaries. But in between, the CAP has become an instrument of productivism and of, well, geared towards global markets, basically the opposite of what we believe it should be. So indeed, for us, it was a test. And consistently, Ursula von der Leyen has refused to make a stance there, because we are at the end of a 7-year period, at the eve of the next one. So this is the moment where you can really reorient the common agricultural policy. Obviously, the proposal made by the Juncker Commission does not go in that direction. It's still pretty much productivist, oriented towards global markets. So to us, the test was, are you willing to withdraw the proposal of the Commission and to make a new one that basically gears subsidies of the CAP to the efforts made by farmers to restore ecosystem services, basically for agriculture to become actually an instrument of fighting climate change rather than a cause that aggravates climate change and the loss of biodiversity. And the answer has been consistently evasive. So this is indeed to the detriment of the credibility of the European Green Deal, because trade policy, agricultural policy, by the way, the two are linked, are indeed ways to test the seriousness of the commitment to the transformation. And I mean, if the European Union is unable or unwilling to transform its premier policy in terms of financial volume, then you might question its willingness to really do the transformation. But yes, you're right. We should transform it deeply, and that means that there will be losers. If you think of the industrial milk farms or the industrial wheat farms, they would stand to lose massively. And I would say, as a liberal, if their business model is not able to run without public subsidies, too bad. Because not only they may not be profitable, but they are destroying the environment. So why should we subsidize that? Conversely, farms that are really contributing to restoring biodiversity or ecosystem services, the quality of soil, the quality of surface waters, these should indeed get subsidies because they produce common goods. And these the price of restoring these common goods cannot be just passed on to the consumer, so they have to be subsidized by the taxpayer in order for these farms to be encouraged doing that. This is the key decision that we need to make. And at the moment, this is where I'm not that optimistic. And my sense is that Ursula von der Leyen decided not to pick that battle, because that's, of course, a very tough battle where resistance, including in her own camp, will be massive. Therefore, I think she decided that this was not a priority battle.
So picking up on, because you've mentioned trade policy a few times, and under the von der Leyen Commission, we've seen some movement in the areas that you mentioned. So climate change is now, I believe, an exclusive element when it comes to EU free trade agreements. The future free trade agreements can be jettisoned if there is non-compliance on the other side. And there's also been recently the movement from the Dutch and the French to beef up the enforceability of the sustainable development chapters. But I suppose amidst all this, it goes back to Lord Haney's point. We do have this fragmenting international system. And do you envision a way through on this in which the EU can both bring in this greater conditionality and still agree trade agreements with new partners and still agree shared norms? Yes, well, I think that there's a space to do that. There's not many partners who are willing to do it, and starting with Europe, because I disagree with the statement that basically we are there. I mean, if you look at all the free trade agreements that we negotiate, when there is a sustainable development chapter, which is not always the case, it is never binding, never enforceable. So it is a decorative
window dressing instrument. Sorry to say that, but as long as it is not legally binding and therefore does not entail the suspension of the free trade agreement, this is just something to sugarcoat the pill so that public opinion will accept that. Now, it would seem that the Dutch and the French now would want to make these chapters binding, but this is the way to go, of course. This is the way to go. Now, it presents difficulties in democratic terms. Let me put it this way. Just imagine that CETA would have basically had the Sustainable Development Chapters binding. You need regulatory cooperation for that. But the risk with regulatory cooperation is that indeed law ends up being written by experts and not by parliaments. One way out could be to say, okay, we commit to one another that, of course, each of the two parties is free to set its own rules, but the other party commits to apply always all parties commit to apply always the most stringent rule, the most protective rule. So it would be an upwards emulation of legislators on both sides of the trade agreement. Now, of course, the difficulty there lies in defining what is the most protective. Protective for what? For investors, for the environment, for biodiversity, for what? And it would be tricky. But there's one thing that, and this is an unpleasant truth. I mean, yes, we need multilateralism, and yes, we have to recognize, and that's European history also, that economic interdependence helps us avoiding wars. That's fact. So we need a degree of economic interdependence. Yes, if you look at it from the climate perspective and environment perspective, miles matter, distance matters. So again, yes, it's good to have some economic interdependence, but if you want to be resilient, globally, but also locally, well, you need to have not too much of it. You need also some local ability. So actually, and this is again very difficult because it's always too easy to paint the public debate in black and white. So we have had globalization, we need now relocalization, nationalization. Actually, no. The thing is that we have taken the cursor too far in the direction of globalization. We need to bring it back to a better balance between local and global, but it is a balance to be found. It is not, okay, now let's go 100% autonomy, because again, it's not good for resilience. I mean, being overly dependent on suppliers far away makes you vulnerable, but being totally self-reliant also makes you vulnerable, because if your economy is hit, if your country is hit by something, well, you need to be able to be helped from the outside. And you need interdependence there. So to me, it's really an issue of finding a better, more reasonable balance between global and local, and I would say between efficiency and resilience. And this is the democratic debate, actually. For 30 years, we were in a world where basically there was no alternative. There was only one way of doing things, and Macron was full of that. We need maximize efficiency. Actually, it's not the end of history, because politics is about deciding where we want to put the balance between local, global, between security and freedom, between resilience and efficiency. And this is what the policy debate should be about these days. So again, we need interdependence, enough of it and not too much of it. But let's face it, if the goal is still to increase trade flows, this is totally incompatible with our climate objectives. So I mean, moving milk powder around the world makes no sense. Absolutely no sense. We need, well, of course, you will not produce the Airbus 350 in each country. So there, the right size for the aviation industry is global. But for the food industry, I'm afraid to say that no, it should be regional. Regional in the sense of a region like the European Union. The right scale is not global.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder to people to raise your hand, click the raise your hand button if you want to come in with a question. I actually just have another one in the meantime. Going back to the starting discussion about the recovery fund and the like, you mentioned that it was not big enough, but macroeconomically significant and a step in the right direction. Do you see this as being a step towards greater mutualization of debt, of the EU needing its own, of actual EU own resources becoming a big part of the discussion, or do you see it as just being a one-time only, let's stop here type measure?
Well, I'm a Democrat, so I do not like to make massive fiscal decisions or decisions that have fiscal impact by stealth. I mean, we need, well, I mean, no taxation without representation. That was the beginning of parliaments. We need to make those decisions as part of a democratic process. But yes, we are putting in place a time-limited instrument, but that will require actually taking long-term loans and reimbursing them over the long term. Now, to reimburse those loans, there will be three options because, well, if the decision is to reimburse them through the European budget, you will need to make space in the European budget to pay the principal and interest. Now, you can do that when time comes, either by reducing spending elsewhere, but that will be hardly acceptable for many member states who are beneficiaries of EU investment. You may simply ask member states to contribute more money to the European budget, but that will be off limits to many countries as well, especially the net contributors. And so the third possibility is basically give the European Union the ability to levy taxes to reimburse those loans. And indeed, member states hate it because by that, they basically lose power. It's about power. But they may come to the conclusion that this will be the least painful option. So yes, we may create a precedent here. Now, should the precedent set the norm for the future? Maybe yes, but that requires really institutional changes. I mean, what I hope is that by experimenting a fiscal union, a targeted and time-limited fiscal union, that this will allow to build trust both in the instrument but also mutual trust in Europe, so that to make that broader and maybe permanent. But again, it will be very important not just to decide on this recovery plan, but to execute it in a way that will increase the degree of trust within the European Union, because let's face it, over the last decades, trust has been eroded year in, year out. And so we need to use this recovery as a trust building instrument that allows us then to take further steps towards a fiscal union. And there, I just want to be very clear, because I'm speaking to a British audience, well, not only, but so like it or not, the United Kingdom is still pretty much a centralized country with a central government. This is not a federal state. Neither is France. And there's often a perception in these countries when we speak about fiscal union of centralization, because, well, the only form of state that the French know is a centralized state. Actually, I come from a federal country, and I'm looking to Germany as basically the example of federal state. What we need indeed is, let's face it, a federal EU state, not one that centralizes everything, because that would be a big mistake, I think, but one that really has the ability to exert fiscal sovereignty in the areas which have been devolved to it. Because we have federalized currency, we have a federalized central bank, we have a very small federal budget of 1% of GDP, and the control mechanism of that budget are not truly federal. So we have a single market, a single currency, but no, we do not have basically a federal state able to levy taxes and accountable of its actions in front of a parliament. And this is the step that we will need to take. And again, that doesn't mean centralizing everything at European level. I don't think it would be a good idea. I'm a strong proponent of this idea of unity in diversity. And that makes us totally different from the United States of America. We see diversity as an asset. And in that sense, I strongly deplore Brexit, because I think that we are losing a very important component of diversity in our collective thinking. I mean, yes, it's true that in terms of openness to the world of geopolitical union of the United Kingdom has contributed a lot. I would say also in terms of regulating finance, where I think the UK is stricter than Paris or Berlin ever were. But we need that diversity. And so the best way to lose diversity is to centralize everything in Brussels. And we don't need to do that, and we don't want to do that. But let's accept, and we see that with the pandemic, that if we have a common free circulation zone, it is nonsense to keep the borders managed by individual border member states. If we have a common currency and a federal central bank, it's quite obvious that you also need to have control, but also the other arm of macroeconomic policy, that is a degree of fiscal policy vested at the European level with the appropriate degree of democratic accountability. So we need to go that way, but this will only happen if trust is being built up as part of this process.
Thank you very much. We've had a wave of questions coming in. I'm going to go first to people who haven't asked a question already, but then if there's time, I will return to people who have already submitted one. So first I have Charles Grant.
Hello, Charles.
Okay, Charles, I will try coming back to you in a second. So I'm going to go to
Hang on. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, there we are. There we are.
Sorry. Okay, right. Thank you. Yes. So my question is really a slightly gloomy question. I mean, I think Philippe and others assume that the COVID-19 crisis will be a chance to promote more respect of green values and green targets. My fear is it may prove the other way around, because my worry is that right-wing populists are going to treat this crisis as a good excuse to drum up opposition to climate change targets. And my central thesis is this, that the COVID-19 crisis is making nearly everybody, quite a lot poorer than they are today. And politicians such as Nigel Farage in Britain, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, the AFD in Germany, the Gilets jaunes in France, argue that if we keep to all these green targets, we're going to be even poorer. We're going to have to get rid of our gas boilers and put in more expensive boilers, get rid of our diesel cars, buy more expensive electric cars. So my worry is that actually we're going to see a new driver of right-wing populism in many EU countries, and it'll be much harder for the EU leaders to respect and maintain their very admirable targets for reducing carbon emissions and other sorts of green targets. I hope I'm too pessimistic, but I don't know, what do you think, Philippe?
I hope too you are. I see the danger. I would first take exception with just one part of what you said, and that's a reference to the Gilets jaunes. I mean, the Gilets jaunes is a very diverse set of people. They have common characteristics. They are usually working people, having income that does not allow them to make ends meet. But I met with hundreds of them, and many of them have very deep-seated ecological convictions. I mean, you cannot just say that the Gilets jaunes are another expression of the far right. This is not true. Are there far-right voters amongst the Gilets jaunes? Absolutely. But I can tell you there are also people who want actually the ecological transition. The only thing is that they do not want the little people to be the ones ending up paying the brunt of the cost of the transition. And there I totally share their views. So with that being said, yes, the risk is there. But actually, when you hear those who have been screaming very early in the pandemic that now that we had the pandemic, we should shelve the Green Deal, were actually the same ones who were already opposing it before the pandemic. What I mean is that I did not see their ranks becoming bigger because of the pandemic. On the contrary, I would say that I've seen more outspoken sections of the business world arguing more forcefully for the green transition. A good example is, and that's in the French context, Jean-Pierre Clamadieu, who used to be CEO of Solvay, and he is now president of forgot his name now, the energy company. Come on, they operate all nuclear power plants. Well, he argues for the transformation. So no, I'm not that worried from that side. Now, from the far right parties, let's admit that they have been taken on the back foot by the pandemic. Now, this is not necessarily a long-term setback for them, but they have not won from the pandemic at the moment. So a lot will depend on how we manage the recovery. If we have an inclusive recovery, we will deprive them of their arguments. Conversely, if we practice the same recipes as after the global financial crisis, where basically we insulate the rich and we make the common folk pay, then indeed the backlash will be terrible, absolutely terrible. My sense is that this is not the intention. So I would say that the neoliberals, even if they are still in the finance ministries, even if they are still in the dominant political parties, they are on the defensive now. And many of their dogmas, like, you know, markets are more efficient than states, that basically the homo is just economicus and all the rest doesn't count, and all the rest of it, that globalization is a unmitigated good thing. All these dogmas have been proven totally wrong by the pandemic. So life will be harder for them to pursue their ideological agenda. So I think that, yes, we have, and you use the term chance. Yes, we have a chance to get this right. Will the chance be seized? I hope so. I have signs it will, but I will only believe it when I see it. And meanwhile, I'm going to do with my group everything I can to push in that direction.
Thank you very much. So next I have Ian Bond.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Philippe. Very interesting. I wanted to go back to what you said about regulatory convergence, and particularly to look at China, and two questions really about regulatory convergence in China. I mean, the first is, to what extent the EU should condition trade with China on progress towards climate targets, bearing in mind that China is adding both renewables and coal-fired power stations to its energy mix, but abroad it's selling an awful lot of coal-fired power stations. And secondly, in terms of labour standards and human rights, whether the EU should be using its economic weight more on China to try to promote improvements in those areas.
Well, I fully agree with both statements. We should be much, much tougher on China, and their past experience shows that the Europeans have been very nice to China. I mean, including Chancellor Merkel. Well, she has basically given a free hand to China to do whatever it wanted, not just on climate, because there Germany is not doing a better job, but on human rights. So on China, I would first take a geopolitical stance, because regardless of climate and all the rest of it, the real question is the EU playing as one towards China? Obviously, China wants to divide the European Union. That's a geopolitical goal of China's. You see the meetings of the 16+1. You see the way they court Italy, etc. I'm not saying they do that in a very subtle way, but their strategy is divide and conquer. Do we see the threat, and do we act accordingly? In other terms, to be heard in China requires as a precondition that we act as a bloc. And there I am really intentionally using the word bloc. That is something that cannot be divided. I mean, as long as big or small member states will think that they can get a better solution for themselves by dealing individually with China, Europe will be weak and will be unable to impose anything on China. Now, impose is again not a good word, because you have to think of history too. I mean, China has been conquered and divided by European powers in the past. And so we should keep in mind that this history is still pretty much present in China as well. So we should try we should tread much more carefully. But if we want to be respected by China, we need to act as one. And that's a condition to anything else, on human rights, on trade, etc. But assuming that we start behaving as a bloc, then indeed we should be much tougher on conditionality of trade, because we know that China still wants to export to Europe, and we have to use that leverage. And indeed, we can increase the leverage by becoming less dependent from China, by having other sources than China. And that requires really a strategic shift in thinking. We so far, sorry to use that term again, but the neoliberal ideologues thought, well, if we make Europe the most open continent on in the world, we will have influence. That is of course not true, because it's like, you know, you go to a sex party and you're the only one naked. Sorry to be a bit blunt, but this is how Europe has gone about. I'm not sure this is a very good way of doing things. And then we become overly dependent. And the mercantilist strategy of Germany, which was basically followed by the European Union, has shown its limits now, both in terms of lack of resilience, but also dependency. I mean, when the US markets or the British markets or the Chinese markets are closing down on German companies, Germany discovers that the notion of economic hinterland, so basically your neighbors, have not disappeared and become more important. So again, we have to act as a bloc and then use the leverage that we have indeed to induce, I wouldn't say impose, but induce change. Now, on climate, it is also in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party to do something on that, because all the environmental challenges are huge in China and potentially destabilizing for the power of the Chinese Communist Party. So of course, there, even not for altruistic reasons, but power reasons, Europe and China's interest might be aligned, actually. And so we should use that. But again, Europe should act as a bloc, but should really be a player for multilateralism. And so there, again, we might have an interest in siding with like-minded countries like Japan, in order to keep defending, I wouldn't say promoting at the moment, but defending what is left of the multilateral order.
Thank you very much. And I didn't mention it, but if people could just please introduce themselves so Philippe knows who he's talking to. The last two questions were from actually CER staff members for Philippe's information. But next I have Tilman Kupfer.
Does this work? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. This is Tilman Kupfer. I work for BT, and thank you, Sam, and thank you, Mr. Lamberts, for your very interesting insights. I wanted to talk about, ask you your views about the interplay between the Green Deal and also digitization, and maybe because you mentioned it also in your discourse already, the inclusive growth or recovery. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting one, because, don't forget, my background is in the IT industry for 22 years before I became an MEP. And of course, the story then was, okay, we need to accelerate the digital transformation because we are dematerializing. And that is, of course, good for the planet. But we are never dematerializing. I mean, it's not because you replace paper with bits that the bits are not material. I mean, they are physical entities that require energy. And so there we have to be careful. Of course, let's take what we are doing right now. If we were all sitting in the same room, we would have traveled, we would have moved our bodies from one place to another, and that would have required energy and would have had an ecological impact. And probably the meeting that we are having now electronically has a lower ecological impact on the planet. That may be positive examples, but there are other examples that are less positive. For instance, a question that for me is still unresolved is, what is the difference between watching Game of Thrones season 8 on streaming versus watching it on a DVD? I don't know what is the most resource intensive. way of achieving the result, which is entertainment in this case. So there can be a positive interplay between the two, and there can be negative interplays as well, because when you have and this is where the rebound effect plays, when you have the impression that actually the new way of doing things is much less resource intensive, you end up consuming much more of it in a way that actually negates the savings that you've been making in terms of ecological impact. So I think that we have to look at that on a business specific basis, because in some areas digitalization will help, in some others it will make things worse. That's the ecological dimension of the issue. And then there's another important issue linked to digitization, and that has to do with civil liberties. Because of course, the fact that you start making data, simply making data existing and then available, creates the risk of the surveillance state and the surveillance capitalism. And so basically, states and big companies basically owning you because they own your data. And this is not science fiction. This is what is happening as we speak. And these are downsides of the digital transformation as well. So again, we should treat carefully and see always, well, make a cost-benefit analysis, but not just in terms of profits, but in terms of well-being. Okay, do we want to do this? And is the impact of what we do through digital solutions actually bringing a benefit to society that is greater than the cost to society? And is this to society, not just to big economic players? Because so far, again, the idea was what is good for the multinationals is good for the people. I never bought into this, but I hope that people start realizing that what is good for Amazon or what is good for BNP Paribas or for Volkswagen is not necessarily good for the US, France, or Germany.
Thank you very much. So next up I have Jennifer Rankin.
Hey, Jennifer.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Great. Thank you very much. So Jennifer Rankin from The Guardian.
I know you.
I likewise. Thanks for doing the event. I wanted to come back to the own resources issue that you talked about earlier. We know that EU leaders or EU ministers in the past have failed to agree on a digital tax, failed to agree on CCCTB. So what do you think is the most likely source of EU tax that can be agreed in the next few years? And how likely is it that the EU might get to, say, 2025, 2026, when these repayments become due and not have a new source of own resources?
Well, indeed, I would not go for carbon border adjustment, because we don't know whether it will come off the ground, and we are not even sure this is the best solution. But I would look at pollution taxes, and of course, taxes on kerosene or on plastics. This is kind of income that is indeed, well, intended to disappear over time. Because we would like pollution to disappear, but it will never disappear absolutely. My choice remains a chunk of corporate taxation. And I know that CCTB, well, there was not the political will to achieve a common corporate and consolidated tax base in Europe, which is a precondition of having a European corporate tax. But I think this is the way to go. And indeed, you may want to start with the digital sector. I would rather do this cross-sector. And so CCCTB is the way to go. Is it, well, people keep saying, and we have that in all the prospectus, past performance is no guarantee for future performance. I hope that the past performance of the ECOFIN on this is not a guarantee for future performance. I think that the pandemic and this recovery plan are game changers. And if we agree to borrow together, we will need to reimburse together. And again, necessity may dictate at the time. And as I said earlier, if additional contributions and reduced expenditures are off the table, the only thing that is left is on resources, that is European taxes. But then again, we are entering a domain that requires very strong democratic legitimacy. I really insist on that. You cannot do a fiscal union by stealth. You need to do it. And again, this is also what my way of reading the German Constitutional Court decision a couple of weeks ago, is that you cannot transfer fiscal sovereignty by stealth. Some judges, probably in Karlsruhe, don't want any transfer of fiscal sovereignty because they don't believe that you can have a working European democracy. But I do believe you can have that if there is the political will and a political process to get there. So again, after 10 years in the European Parliament, I'm still and even more a European idealist. But I do believe, even if I was a bit at a loss at the beginning of my term, my last term in the Parliament a year ago, I think that in a way, the pandemic opened doors that many believed totally shut up until now. So let's hope that that European decision makers, including us in the Parliament, will rise to the occasion and make the right decisions.
Thank you very much. And Hugo, coming back to Hugo Dixon, who has a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you very much. Hugo Dixon from InFacts. You mentioned at the beginning of your introduction about the bailouts that we are seeing. Obviously, there have been big bailouts of KLM, Air France, Lufthansa, now the French automotive industry. These are all large polluters, carbon creators, and the strings attached to them have been either very limited or possibly not at all. Has that horse already bolted, or is there any way in the coming weeks, months, and years that conditionality can be attached when the money has already been lent?
Yeah, indeed, when the money has been lent, you lose your leverage. So you have to put the conditionality into place at the moment you provide subsidies or loans. So indeed, for a number of cases, it's already too late. And I deplore that, because there you can see that the DNA of those who are in power at the moment, either at political level or administrative level, their DNA is still pretty much neoliberal. That whatever goes, you know, conditionality for jobless workers, but no conditionality for shareholders. And I'm afraid to put it that way, but that is really how they think, that, you know, make the rich richer because they know best. And I do not share that, but that's basically what has been done so far. So I agree with your analysis, but there's still time, because the bulk of the recovery plan is yet to come. And there we need to be much stricter. Now, let me be clear, because if I were a prime minister at the moment, I would still try to avoid the collapse of major companies. Because, well, you know, I worked 22 years in a big multinational, IBM, and that was a company that at its peak had 420,000 people. And actually, such an organization capabilities comes from the wealth of immaterial capital vested in the organization and in the people. When you let an organization like that collapse, actually you lose that material capital, and rebuilding it is awfully difficult and expensive. So I'm not against creative destruction, and we need to transition our economies, but precisely transition is the operative word. It is not destruction, reconstruction. And I know, of course, destruction, reconstruction gives you more possibilities, because when you start from a green field or brown field, it's easier to build it the way you like it. But in order to get there, you have destroyed a lot of stuff that you may need moving forward. And this is why we Greens speak about the green transition. We are not revolutionaries. We are what I like to call ourselves radical reformists. So we are radical in the sense that we need to go to a world that is radically different from the one we are in today, but we want to go it through reforms, not through revolutions. And if I were the French Prime Minister or the German Chancellor, I would indeed try to avoid the collapse of even airline industries, because of course you can be ideological and say, I want to get rid of air transport. But are we going to have a world with zero air transport? I don't think so. Now, if you want to transform the airline industry, you need to avoid it collapsing, right? So indeed, you have to impose conditionality, but you have to impose it in a way, okay, if you tell Lufthansa, you need to be green on the date you receive support, that's just impossible. That's just a death warrant for Lufthansa. But conversely, you cannot say, okay, we help you now and you'll be nice to us later. We have to say to the airline industry, okay, we are going to support you guys, but there will be no question, there will be a kerosene taxation. So the tax advantage that the air transport has enjoyed so far will be nixed. We are going to suppress it. And so when you think of your business model tomorrow, take that into account, because we are going to allow you to live, but your lives will be very different tomorrow than they were before. And again, we do not need the agreement of the industry. They may still lobby us, but we need to have the guts to do it and to say, okay, we are going to avoid the collapse of a number of airlines, but part of the package is that we, policymakers, are going to impose kerosene taxation, are going to reduce takeoff and landing slots, because we need to curb air transport and conversely invest in surface transport. This is what we are going to do. So guys, get prepared for that world, because making money in the airline industry will be much more difficult tomorrow than yesterday. And so be inventive. And you know, some people say, well, of course, in the industry, they always want subsidies to do the right thing. And sorry, I'm not convinced by that. Innovation also comes out of necessity. I mean, when you tell the car industry that the diesel engine will be gone by 2030, for instance, you do not subsidize investment, you force investment. Because actually, Volkswagen still wants to be in business. But of course, if they can be in business the easy way, that is basically milking the cow, the diesel cow, they will. Because again, capitalists will want cheap, well, easy money. No one's like making efforts. But if the price of staying in business is investing in transformation, then they will do it. And they don't need subsidies. They need a kick in the ass. And that's how it should work. We should get back to policymakers rather, and you may call that punitive ecology. No, it's just setting the rules, and there's always a price of doing business. We have to get this price right.
Thank you. I realise that people who are calling in from their mobile phones or landlines can't virtually raise their hands. So if anyone who's calling in has a question, could I just ask you to speak up now? I'll just stay silent for a few seconds to give you time. But no pressure, of course.
There's someone speaking, but we can't hear.
Okay, I can't hear anything, so I'm going to take that as a no. We are coming to the end of the session, Philippe, and I wondered if maybe I'd just give you sort of the chance to conclude by laying out, so in an ideal world, what is the Greens' vision for this recovery fund? I think you've hinted at it in different ways. But,
yeah, I think so.
But I think we should allow you to give your pitch.
Well, I invite you to go to our website to see our comprehensive transition plan. No, the difficulty for the Greens is this: is that okay? No one of us saw the pandemic coming. Let's face it. Yet, many ingredients of the post-pandemic sustainable order were already part of our program. So in a way, it's not, we've been taken by surprise, but actually what needs to be done is pretty much in sync with what we have been proposing all along. So a challenge for us has always been, since the pandemic and even now, to avoid the told you so attitude, you know, well, we knew it all and we know what to do. I think that we understood the issue of the right balance between localism and globalism, between resilience and efficiency, better than others. I mean, especially if you look at the history of the Greens, resilience has been at the heart of what we do. I mean, on the planet side, on the social justice side, we want to make our societies resilient. basically solid, able to withstand shocks, to be able to live over the long term. And so, of course, that differentiates us from those who have always thought that economic efficiency was the only yardstick by which to measure progress in society. So, yes, in a way, we have been more prepared. So, but the issue is then an issue of credibility for us, because even if an increasing part of public opinion sees the Greens as a go-to alternative when times are rough, we still are seen by many as with a deficit on economic abilities and on the issue of social justice. So typically from the right, people will attack us by saying that we are economically incompetent. Their case is harder to make today than in the past, yet you cannot just be happy that your opponents can less easily criticize us. You have to prove yourself. And from the left, the traditional attacks were, yeah, okay, Greens are a luxury product, and they will make sure that the rich people can walk in clean forests. But actually, our project is about a decent life for everyone, and not just for the happy few. So we need to prove that. And the challenge that we have as Greens now is that we are present in 4 governments in Europe. We are supporting a 5th from the outside. The challenge for us is in these times to get into the executive branch, to prove indeed that we are up to the challenges. We are going to have a chance in Ireland in the coming weeks. We might have a chance of doing that in Belgium in the coming months, and possibly in Germany as well. So this will be also for the Greens family a very important moment, because this will be also the moment where we need to prove ourselves in difficult times. Arguably, well, we were in power in Ireland during the global financial crisis. Bad decisions have been taken at that moment, and we have been burnt for being part of the government at the time, which also explains why the Irish Greens are cautious about getting back into government. But again, you have to learn from your past mistakes. And I do believe that as a political force, we have grown in maturity over the last 10 years. I think we have proven that in the European Parliament, and increasingly in a number of member states, not all of them. But we want to be part of the solution. Again, I believe personally in collective intelligence. No one has all the answers. But I also do believe that you can draw from actors of change in all sides of society. But make no mistake about that, I do not believe in unanimism. I mean, the green transformation will put at stake vested interests and count on those vested interests to resist fiercely. But we want to be on the right side of history. That is our challenge. So thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure that we will have further opportunities down the road.
Thank you so much. I'm sure if you could see everyone and there's a room, people would be giving you a round of applause. But for now, you'll just have to accept my face and my gratitude. So thank you, Philippe.
It was a pleasure.